We're ready. Hey, everybody. Nice to see you all here. Thanks for coming. I guess everybody's going to introduce themselves. Is that okay? Because, this is our Revolutionary Network Politics panel discussion group. But it's only the beginning today because we're only really, in 90 minutes, we're only really going to be able to scratch the surface of most of the things we really want to talk about. So we organized an off-transmediale workshop, which is just across the street. Well, here's the where we are now, and it's right across the street here in this building. Oops. Yeah, this building here. It's looks like this. It's the Karl Liebknecht house, and we're in here somewhere, right in the front. So it's at 3 p.m. and it's an open event, so it's also open for people who don't have tickets. So if you are blown away by what we're sharing over here, you want to hear more, you want to tell your friends, they can also go there, also without a ticket.
D-Linke building. It's the D-Linke building.
It's the D-Linke building. They have a big, it's a very historical building. D-Linke. Okay, so let's get right to business because we have a packed program for you. And I will start. So hi, I'm Baruch Gottlieb, and I am a member of Telekommunisten, so working as an artist, curator, and sometime seminarist, symposium convener, etc. And you can follow me at Baruch on Twitter if you like. So mostly what we're going to be talking about today is the political, do you have the timer going? The political economy of E2E. We want to cut through all the metaphors and ground the abstractions because really it's, if we want to engage with the facts on the ground, the way we encounter our network experience, we have to get to material concerns. So by now, it's pretty common to hear at these kind of festivals, oh yes, the network is material. There is no immateriality anyway, but there's certainly no immateriality in the network. It's made up of all kinds of levels of phenomena from the ground up. So part of this materiality is built infrastructures, as you know, also the ones that you encounter in your hand when you're accessing the networked affordances. Geo-industrial apparatus, this is like power grids, etc. All those things have to be built, yeah.
There's a request to make it full screen.
Full screen? Oh my God, that's the only thing that I'm a little bit concerned about. I was trying to avoid that question. Hold on a second. Is it F5? I always forget. Oh, slideshow? No. Slideshow. No. Slideshow, then it's going to start going by itself. Window. Okay, window. No, it's view. It's view.
Is it okay?
It's in view. Oh my God, nobody ever. I've been spoiled by my. No, it's not there. Yeah, I think it's F. I think it's F5 usually.
F11.
F11? Okay, let's try that. F5. Here we go. Hold on. F5. No. Yes, it's doing something. Okay, that's it. There we go. Is that better? Come on.
Yeah, much better.
It's not like you get the full. You're not outside of the experience. Woo. Okay.
Immersive.
So, all right. So it's immersive. Exactly. Immersive. You want to forget your. But we cannot forget. That's what the point of today's talk is, that we cannot forget our material affordances that permit this kind of leisurely encounter with this very difficult condition that we're engaging with right here. There's planetary affordances, of course, the minerals, fuels, the chemistry of the planet itself, as we're understanding more and more through new materialism, like the actual atomic properties of metals, of minerals that are active in our devices are the recordings of cosmic events that happened millions and millions of years ago that we're extracting value from, we're extracting reliability from on a regular basis. And that is something that we shouldn't take for granted. We should kind of find a way to encounter this. And a lot of what we're talking about here is dialectics. It's like encountering tensions between, for example, our experience online and the material basis on which these experiences are afforded and reproduced. And the last materiality, of course, is life. It's us. whenever you think, well, there must be some immateriality, there must be like an idea or something, but the idea has to live somewhere, and it lives in you, and you have to be reproduced. So thank the farmers. Okay, so again, there's no immateriality in network computation. Therefore, what we can and cannot do online is conditioned by material affordances. It is still about sovereignty over and ownership of land, of title, and devices. That means because it's all material, it matters who owns that material, who has sovereignty over that material. If we want to change our material conditions, we need to address that question. Therefore, our socio-economic and political prospects in the age of network computation need to be addressed materially. Okay, so one of the ways that we decided to look at, seeing as we're both really interested, involved in developing alternative ways to meet, get together, share, also, materially concerned, make, the way that we reproduce our own lives better. So through communication, through exchanging online, internationally, eventually we're going to have to develop these affordances. We started to have end-to-end group meetings. Started off as the blockchain research group. That was the first group. We thought, okay, let's investigate the potential of the blockchain to emancipate humanity. It was actually billed as a very promising technology that was really going to split us out of the nation-state, strictures and everything, and we're going to have this new international realm where everything was possible. We could also collaborate between cooperatives, etc. We haven't seen that so much yet, but we're working on it. Distributed Systems was the next version. We changed the name to Distributed Systems Research Group, and then we ended up with the end-to-end meeting. So then and that went on for about 3 years. And this is what we were doing. We were researching high-performance social interaction applications where the functionality is hosted locally. That means that everybody, if you know torrent, if you've ever used BitTorrent, this is like where the functionality is hosted locally. The storage is hosted locally, everything goes from end to end. And this is a good example of a relatively successful, it's so successful that the law has been invoked to make access to it or use of it more difficult, right? It is so successful and so disruptive to the status quo that it actually has caused the law to be invoked, as you know, here in Germany, if you use the torrents. Okay, so we built up something called an evaluation grid, and maybe I can call it up if I here should. Okay, thank you. This is what our grid looks like, and we'll share it with you later. You can see that on one side of the grid we have a bunch of promising projects that we thought we should investigate. All these projects in some way or another promise another mode of communication, of exchange end to end, and we wanted to evaluate them according to what's on the horizontal bar at the top, these criteria. So for example, a system must work in a way that users by default provide more resources than they use. So that is one of the fundamental principles, that there's no, by participating in the network, you provide services, and everybody profits from that together, and that the totality is more than the sum of its parts, and we have an economy of scale that actually could replace supplant some of the affordances that we count on from Facebook, banks, etc. So we looked at a bunch of projects, but I won't go into them too much. There's the DAT project, which has a beaker browser. It's also like a torrent for data, storing data encrypted on machines, every machine, and then you can kind of browse it depending on how many privileges you have, depending on your social graph. Patchwork is a similar one, so I don't have time because I have 2 minutes and 25 seconds. You'll be happy to hear. Okay, so this is what we want to do. We want to produce a privacy-respecting, informationally secure planetary affordance for all manners of social interactions with low overhead and high accessibility. Of course, this will not by itself produce an alternative planetary economy, but can help support the generation and sustainability of other modes of autonomous collaborative production at global scale. And that's what we're really talking about. We have to make the affordances on the edge, end to end, if we want to scale globally in competition, as you'll see with Dmytri's presentation in a moment, with the massive centralized architectures that we're used to using, we have a reason why we use them, because they really work for various purposes. E2E has to be able to provide for viable living conditions and to serve movements. The thing is that we're not just talking about just abstractly another way of communicating that in and of itself, or a new technological means that we use that in and of itself is going to emancipate human potential. Actually, for it to be embraced, it has to serve to help provide livelihoods for people. It has, in a different way, that make new opportunities for people. And that's the same thing with any political movement, of course. And the last point is that computer networks are military equipment. We have to kind of understand and kind of somehow find, and that's another dialectical point, how we can integrate this consciousness that actually we are using military equipment to organize our lives, and that there has never been a civilization, at least a civilization that has been technologically advanced, that does not have a military and doesn't have military imperatives. And these imperatives are built into our system. It's built into the way we attend to our needs and our lives. So we have to understand there is that aspect, and it's not necessarily a bad aspect. It has, as Bernard Stiegler, I don't know if you were at the talk yesterday, but he was fond of using this word pharmacon. It is sometimes a poison, sometimes a cure. You know, this military aspect is a way of organizing, and it's built in. We have to kind of grok the materiality of that to understand our situation. And that's my presentation.
Wow.
Very good on time. Are we going to put time for a group discussion? We're going to move on to the next presentation?
No, you're supposed to respond to me now.
Right, so we don't need this.
You don't need. We have 5 minutes. Yeah, actually, you should.
We have 5
it's 5 minutes.
Okay.
You guys are supposed to.
We're going
say,
to try to be organized.
Was I talking nonsense, or does that make?
We're going to reset to 10, and we'll just stop at 5.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean,
Wait, you need a mic.
I need a mic. We've all got our own mic. Here, you've got a mic.
So we only have
Everybody's
5
got a mic.
minutes, so.
Does this thing work? Hello, can you hear me?
I got it.
Start it.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
I think it's one of the things that's interesting about the kind of progression of, like, from the blockchain research group to the distributed systems research group to the end-to-end is that we kind of came in with a sort of a suspicion around this narrative that was going on around the time that we have a centralized social media internet with centralized search and centralized social media, and that by writing some software we can create a decentralized one. And I think from the beginning we were suspicious of this narrative because the history is actually quite different. The history is we had a centralized platform in the era of the online services like AOL and CompuServe and MCI and stuff. Then the internet came, which was a decentralized platform with Usenet, IRC, Finger, email. And then the centralized came afterwards. So the whole premise that just by writing some new software we can somehow go backwards seems suspicious. So we wanted to understand the architectures, and we wanted to understand the materiality. We wanted to, like, really look closely at the question of why the internet was re-centralized in the first place, right? And what we found interesting as we looked through all these different technologies is some of them really introduced new ideas that we felt were a path forward, things like BitTorrent and Patchwork, but then some were simply recreating the federated type systems that were of the internet, the more modern versions of things like Usenet, Finger, IRC, etc., which seemed like a futile project to us. Would seem like, well, you're just, if that stuff already was defeated by the centralized platforms, why do you think programming it again and again and again will make it different? So that's kind of like what explains sort of the kind of arc in the thinking of the group, which I thought was really cool.
Still good?
Other comments?
I mean, we have, like, yeah. I mean, there's still a lot of people putting their hope into federated Usenet type services like Mastodon and Diaspora, and that's one of the things we wanted to look at, why those projects fail to scale or fail to get the usership.
Exactly.
And one of the major problems that we faced, or we saw that was being encountered, is just being able to maintain, now it's federated infrastructure instead of being completely distributed infrastructure, right? Like, and so, like, when you have what happens with like Mastodon or Diaspora, even though in principle you can host it yourself, most people don't want to develop the skills or don't have the time after putting the baby to bed to maintain a Mastodon.
You can also host your own email server or your own Usenet server, but nobody in practice does.
With in the case of something like Mastodon, I'm assuming the audience has been hearing about these things a bit already.
Show of hands. Who knows what Mastodon is?
Okay. So yeah, in the case of Mastodon, the first step to using it is, of course, to pick who your single point of failure is going to be, and try to evaluate the options available. I mean, or you can run it yourself if you have that capability, which most people don't, obviously. So picking a good single point of failure is step one for Mastodon, and in practice, that seems kind of like a difficult choice. But we'll talk more about that, I guess, in a bit.
Depends how your single point of failure is reproduced materially, right? Because like, how are they solving their?
Exactly, and that's what I'm going to get into.
Okay, so let's switch.
Wait, one thing I wanted to say. I just realized during your presentation I should have been going to your meetings the last 3 years. So
You were at one at least.
I was at one.
You're at the secret kitchen meetings. Those are.
You were. Okay, now I have to find. Oh, I have to get out of this.
Okay, more technical theater. There we go.
Well,
What did you call it? Technical difficulty theater?
Really easily. Okay, and now we're into Dima.
Yeah, and then.
Can I?
Should we switch? Should I switch places? Is that how we're going to do it, or are we going to move the computer?
No, it's better to don't trust moving the computer.
Okay, we'll switch places then.
Yeah, but how can I get? Oh yeah, here, enter full screen. Look at that, you guys.
Full screen.
We got full screen again. All
Very
right.
good.
Look at that.
Very good. So is this microphone working okay for everybody? We'll just keep it. Awesome. So going further in this question is I want to take a real close look at what actually is the political economy of network topologies and these kinds of communications, so we can start to really understand what centralization works and what and how the topology of the system, whether it's end-to-end or centralized or federated, relates to the prospects for the system itself. So I started off with a kind of a very simple question: what is Facebook, right? Everybody knows Facebook is the world's biggest centralized social media platform. So when people complain about centralized social media platforms that are based on surveillance and so forth, Facebook is pretty much what they're talking about, the main one. It's not the only one, but it's the main one. And then we all know that capitalism is in there somewhere, that something is very capitalist about the way Facebook operates, but it's a little bit mysterious, and there's a lot of discussion around what Facebook means as a capitalist company, right? So capitalism is normally understood as putting machinery in the hands of labor and appropriating the product for sale on the market, right? So that is what most people understand to be capitalism, right? So it has a bunch of different components: labor, machinery, products that are sold, and if they're not sold, then it's not a productive capitalist cycle, right? So what is machinery? So machinery is a means for producing surplus value. There's a great quote in Capital Chapter 15, right? Machinery is intended to cheapen commodities, and by shortening that portion of the working day in which the laborer works for himself, to lengthen the other portion that he gives without an equivalent to the capitalist. So this is describing the production of surplus value, and it's showing the role of machinery is increasing surplus value. So that is the role of machinery within the capitalist mode of production. Right? But Facebook is not machinery. It doesn't produce surplus value. It's not labor saving. In fact, maybe it's procrastination generating, labor destroying. So it doesn't have the same kind of, you can't really call it machinery in a classic capitalist analysis, right? It's also not a commodity. The platform is not a commodity. It's provided for free. You don't pay for Facebook. The content is not a commodity. It's provided for free, and not even by Facebook, often by the users themselves. So there's no product. So we have no machinery, and we don't really have a product either, right? it doesn't really exploit its workers. I don't know if anybody's ever worked in the tech sector or what's sometimes called above the API labor, the people that are controlling the systems. But, you know, it's hard to imagine Facebook tech workers as being exploited. Nothing's being really taken from them. They have pretty good jobs. They get paid well. As we already said, there's no machinery and no commodity. So there's not really labor as such either, right? So what kind of capitalism is this that has no machinery, no product, and not really any labor? So to understand this, it's helpful to think about invisible labor, a concept that's also called reproductive labor, and is elaborated mostly in Marxist feminism. Right? The way invisible labor works, and it's often applied to domestic labor under patriarchy, so domestic labor in the home, right? The homemakers do not sell their labor power. So homemakers also, like Facebook, do not sell their labor power. They get a free platform, a house and a kitchen. It's free, right? They work for free. They perform reproductive and affective labor to take care of their family. And the result is the labor power of their husband and the future labor power of their children, right? Then the husband sells his labor power as a commodity and pays for the house and the kitchen, right? So the reproductive cycle doesn't work like the normal labor cycle, where the labor is sold directly, a commodity is made, the commodity is sold. It's indirect. The reproductive labor reproduces the stock of labor power, the labor power of the husband and the future labor power of the children, and it's that stock that's then sold as a commodity. So it reproduces the stock of labor power that's available to be sold in the market, and that's when it's realized, and then it pays for the free house and kitchen, right? So if we look at Facebook from that point of view, it starts to make a lot more sense, right? You don't sell your labor power to Facebook. You get a free platform, Facebook. You work for free. You share with and care for your friends on Facebook. And the result is an audience on Facebook, right? And then Facebook sells that audience as an audience commodity to pay for the platform. So once again, the labor is indirect. Like the housework forms the commodity of labor power, and that commodity of labor power is sold to the market. Same with reproductive labor on Facebook. You create another commodity, of audience commodity, and that commodity is sold. So it's indirect. So it's not exploited in the classical sense because you're not actually selling your labor power directly to Facebook. What you're doing is you're helping Facebook build a stock of something else, of audience commodity, that it then sells to its real customers, the advertisers, right? So Facebook isn't your boss, it's not your landlord, it's not your grocer, it's not even your banker, right? Facebook is your husband. Right. Your abusive, invasive, controlling, psychopathic husband. It's his actual profile pic. I didn't pick that pic because it looks weird. That's what he put on his own Facebook profile. Right? So what is audience commodity, right? Like all commodities, audience commodity is sold by grade and measure, right? So eggs, for instance, can be sold as 1 dozen grade A eggs. Network cable can be sold as 10 meters of Cat5 cable, right? So you always have an amount of something, a measure of it, at a certain level of quality, a grade, right? So commodities are always sold by grade and measure. And same with audience commodity. It's also sold by grade and measure. Audiences can be sold as 1,000 impressions or clicks from a middle-aged white man with a credit card who has recently Googled weight loss, right? So it's not just the measure, it's not just the clicks, it also has to be graded. You need to know the grading of the audience commodity. So commodities must be graded, right? And because commodities must be graded, in order to grade commodities, Facebook needs to gather as much information about you as possible and exchange information with its advertisers and its partners. So since Facebook is in the business of selling audience commodity, the surveillance is not just an accident. It's not an oversight. It's not they just don't care about privacy or that they've made some mistakes about privacy they're getting better at. It's that the requirement to grade the commodity that they're selling requires the surveillance. Because when you're selling a commodity, like audience commodity, it has to be sold by grade and measure, right? So they have to grade the commodity. And the requirement to grade the commodity means they need to spy on you in order to provide their advertisers and business partners the information to purchase this commodity at the grade they're looking for, right? The profit itself, of course, comes from the global workers that produce the things that are sold on Facebook, right? So Facebook isn't actually creating any value, either the workers in value in the capitalist sense. All the value is created by the workers in the world's workers that are producing the products that are sold on Facebook, right? And Facebook, so therefore, depends on the exploitation of these workers to make money, because if these workers aren't exploited, there's nothing to sell. If nothing to sell, then they can't sell audience commodity to the advertisers, which is where their profits come from, right? So because of that, Facebook doesn't show you what you want to see, right? It shows you what its advertisers want you to see, right? So again, the logic of the Facebook timeline is not just weird because they're just making some mistakes. They're doing a bad job of organizing a timeline. It's that their interests are completely different from yours. You're interested in seeing what your best friends and most interesting things that you're following are doing. They're interested in getting you to engage with advertising, right? So the entire timeline is made in such a way to instrumentalize your labor, right? So Facebook cannot work without the exploitation of global workers, surveillance, and instrumentalization. In order for the Facebook model to work, there has to be exploited workers whose products are being sold by advertisers. The advertisers have to buy audience commodity. That audience commodity is generated by your instrumentalization, by organizing the timeline in such a way to maximize your engagement with the advertising. And in order to sell that at a grade as a commodity to the advertisers, they need the surveillance, right? So all of that is part of the logic of the centralized platform itself. It's not design choices they're made, but it's implied by the way the business operates, right? And so it's a great quote from Audre Lorde. For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They may allow us to temporarily beat him at his own game, but they will never enable us to bring about genuine change. And that's also to keep in mind in terms of people that use Facebook for activist profile or activist projects in order to like promote activist events. That of course we have to reach the people where they are, which means Facebook as much as the park and the shopping mall, which are also private spaces. But we have to understand that the master's tools are working against us. Right? So how do we build resources for popular communication? How do we move away from a centralized thing like Facebook, right? And we need a room of our own, to use the terms of Virginia Woolf, right? That in order to actually escape the instrument of Facebook, we need to create something that is operated under a different logic, something that is not based on exploitation and instrumentalization and surveillance, right? But, why do we always fail to do so? We've tried many times, like everybody in this room, or a large percentage of this room, heard of Mastodon. I'm sure a lot of you have heard of Statusnet, Diaspora, and various other attempts to re-decentralize the internet, and they often fail. So why? Why do they fail despite all of our attempts? And for this, one of the core outputs of the EDE group, and you've heard this in Baruch's slides when he talked about our evaluation metrics, is that we want to add the capitalist analysis of platforms into the threat model. So who knows what a threat model is? Not too many people. So a threat model is what you do if you're trying to secure a software system. So when you're building a software system, you want to be concerned about its security. So a way to address that is you create a threat model that says, here are the ways this system could be attacked, and so we need to mitigate those particular threats. And threat models usually have like a cast of characters that are used. Alice and Bob are typically the ones communicating. So that's usually modeled as Alice is trying to communicate with Bob, and then there's all kinds of bad actors like Eve and Mallory and things like that are eavesdropping, right? So alternatives tend to focus on malicious attacks, right? But what we wanted to focus on, well, why is Eve trying to attack Alice and Bob? Who is Eve working for? What is Eve's motivation to be trying to intercept this communication, right? And so there's another threat out there besides Eve, Mallory, Sybil, and the others, and that it's often ignored, and it's this guy. It's rich Uncle Pennybags, which is what we call the Pennybags attack, which is described in the first column of the evaluation criteria that Baruch showed earlier. And what we describe as the Pennybags attack is the platform is vulnerable to the Pennybags attack when its architecture becomes more expensive with each new user, right? So the material upkeep of the servers and admins becomes too large for voluntary operation. And that's where we see this failure pattern over and over again, because whether you're running a Usenet server or a Diaspora node or a StatusNet node, you still require centralized infrastructure, even though it's federated and decentralized in the sense that there's more than one. For the given group of users, there's only that one server. And the more users that server has, every new user means the cost of running those servers, the cost of administrating those servers goes up. So every new user is a net liability to the network. Every new user costs the network more money, right? So rich Uncle Pennybags shows up with money and a glint in his eye and says, hey, you've got audience commodity that I can maybe instrumentalize here. Why don't we make a deal? Why don't I give you some money? So either then they go into a business model and start to collect data, or they just go out of business and vanish, like we've seen so many in the past do, right? And so to resist this attack, we need software that does not require a server, right? So that there's no central place that requires more and more administration, more and more money to run, right? But runs on the computers of the users, right? So all of us bring our own computers. Whenever you're accessing Facebook, it's not only Facebook's computers that you're using, you also have a computer yourself, otherwise you can't access Facebook. And this computer that's in front of you actually has a lot more resources, a lot more RAM, a lot more internet, a lot more disk and generally than Facebook can make available to one individual user, because they have to scale for millions. So you have a lot more powerful computing resources right in front of you than the ones you're accessing online in Facebook, right? So BitTorrent is a great example of an end-to-end system, right? Like, so if you put a video on YouTube, the more people that watch that video, the more money it costs YouTube to distribute that video. The more server resources they need, the more administrators they need to maintain that server resources. But of course, they also monetize that with advertising. So back to the audience commodity selling, right? Whereas when you share something on BitTorrent, because it's running on everybody's end computers or seed boxes, every new person that is downloading that, by default, is also seeding it. So it's also making more people able to download it, right? So with BitTorrent, the more people that are downloading a video, the more people can download the video, because every new user is adding capacity. Whereas with YouTube, the more people that are downloading a video, the more it costs to deliver the video. So the relationship is inversed. So the Pennybags attack attacks the centralized resources, so the way to protect yourself against that is to distribute it. And so building an end-to-end system, however, is hard. And I think this will be my last slide. Because capital won't pay for it, because the kind of decentralized systems that we've talked about are not able to produce audience commodity. So this audience commodity-based business model of instrumentalizing the users to create audience commodity, selling that to advertisers, that doesn't work for a decentralized system. So capital won't pay for it, right? Neoliberal states won't pay for it either. I mean, in previous times, maybe like we built libraries and phone systems and stuff with public money. So in previous times, maybe we could have publicly decided that just like we need public communication infrastructure, we want to make a public distributed social media platform. But in these times, when governments are paying for less and less and don't even want to pay for kindergartens anymore, making them pay for a distributed social media platform seems unlikely. And the media will demonize it, right? Because it takes away their centralized control. So if anybody remembers the early days of P2P, when P2P first was talked about, it was the hottest thing ever. Every magazine, everything was talking about how the future would be P2P, and everybody would have intelligent agents to browse the web for them, and everything would be decentralized. And now, if you hear about P2P in the media, they're only ever talking about pirating videos, criminals, and like copyright violations, and now it's a contraband, right? So P2P has been demonized by the media rather than being an exciting new technology that makes communication more efficient. It's a technology that is only used by pirates and criminals, right? And it requires a dedicated community. I think this will also dovetail to your talk a little bit. Is that you can't develop You can't develop software in isolation. So even if you have those other things taken care of, like how you're going to pay for it and who's going to fund it and things like that, too often software communities kind of just work in isolation, imagine they know what the user wants, build software that nobody asked for, and then release it and are surprised when nobody understands it or uses it, right? In order to really make something that actually goes somewhere, it has to be built with an already active community, such as the Global South social movements and other communities that have a real need for alternative technologies. If you make it with them and you work with users such that you understand, what they really need and they're driving the project, that would also make it more successful. And I'm gonna stop with that, and we can move on from there. So thank you.
Perfect. Yeah, you're gonna 5 minutes. Yeah.
Can you talk a little about the what the penny bags attack looks like in practice for these sort of federated systems? How that looks?
Absolutely. I mean. So a federated system like Mastodon or Usenet, Usenet was very dear to my heart. That was the internet when I started using the internet. Usenet access was the thing you were paying for, and eventually, these servers require upkeep, right? And so at a certain point, a server starts to have more and more users, and it starts to go beyond the capacity of some kind of volunteer group or even small business to pay for the server resources and the administration of that server. And at that point, they're forced with a decision, right? Either they work with Rich Uncle Pennybags and they create a model by which they can instrumentalize their users in order to stock audience commodity and sell it and start spying on their users and collecting their data, or they cease operations, or they go out of business because they can no longer afford it. And so that's the base of the penny bags attack. It becomes an existential attack on a community that can no longer afford to sustain the users that it has. So sometimes they try to create a business model, but then that becomes exclusionary, right? So very often we've seen people say, oh wait, what if we just charged our users like $5 a month or something like that, right? Like app.net tried to do that, and there's been other approaches. But the problem there is that means that automatically you're excluding people, right? So you can try a donation-based approach where that it's optional, but then you have to spend resources on donating, right? So creating a business model that allows you to continue to operate the centralized federated node without working with Mr. Pennybags and instrumentalizing your users in the creation of audience commodity is very difficult. And we haven't seen anybody really pull it off, right? We've seen different ways, people try in different ways, and it invariably fails in the same way.
I think this slide is really good to end on, because the requires a dedicated community thing is something I think about a lot, because I'm a DevOps engineer and an IT administrator, and when I go to events and conferences with people who build this kind of stuff, I want to run away and I hate it so much. And I've always felt like requires a dedicated community. I've never felt like part of the community, whatever that is, whether it be Chaos Computer Club or whatever. And I've always felt like, coming personally from a community organizing background and then learning to do tech, I feel like that's what we need, is to organize ourselves and get this dedication. How do we do that? By radicalizing people in the tech community and getting people who can build this stuff actually on board with these politics.
Yeah, I think it comes to also the material conditions, how the community reproduces itself, because the community has to thrive through the use of this technology. So that's where we need also new approaches. I was going to ask you about the role of advertising, for example, or if we look at Patchwork for another example of a very what do you call it? Success story in terms of our analysis. Patchwork, Secure Scuttlebutt. They're at the limit of their ability to provide for their community, and that's a very distributed one, but still they're at the limit. So how can Patchwork grow?
So the Patchwork, I'm guessing that not too many people know what Patchwork is. Anybody know what Patchwork is? How many people know what Patchwork is?
Or Secure Scuttlebutt.
Secure Scuttlebutt, yeah. So Secure Scuttlebutt is a rumor database. Pardon? Yeah. So Secure Scuttlebutt is a rumor database that allows distributed systems to operate by distributing the database through this rumor kind of system, which messages are kind of passed around, and this creates an end-to-end model. And they've created a social network on top of this called Patchwork, which is very Twitter-like, kind of like maybe even a little bit Facebook-like, and then it's got groups and things like that. And it's really good, but they have a different problem. Is that, well, first of all, they have a discoverability problem, right? Because you know how to find Facebook. You go to facebook.com and there's Facebook, right? If it's a distributed database, that means that no information is kind of shared. So if you install Patchwork, you'll be on a social network with only one person on it, you, and nobody else, right? And so finding other people and discovering other people requires like pub/sub things like that. So there's some engineering complexity there, and that's their kind of major drawback, is that they're not funded. There's no capital behind them. There's no public funds behind them.
There is some capital behind some Patchwork clients now.
For stuff.
And the iOS one also. There's a not free software Patchwork client now on iOS with some blockchain money. But
is it fun? Is it like funding from a foundation?
No, it's
or
like
is it
VC money.
Okay.
But that's not the main Patchwork thing. That's some other project that's using it. But I think the important distinction between things like Mastodon and things like Secure Scuttlebutt is that with Mastodon, your identity lives on a server. So you have a URL that's some somebody's DNS domain name / your name, and that's where your identity is. You're completely tied to that server. With Secure Scuttlebutt, you don't have a relationship with any server that is that important. There's pub servers that can carry your content, but your identity is a public key. So if I follow you on one server and that server goes away, I can still get your posts from other servers. So they don't have the same sort of fragility that federated things like Mastodon have.
Yeah, that's right. Just to emphasize that point, if you sign up for a Mastodon node and that Mastodon node goes away, like the people that are operating it can no longer afford to operate, then not only do you lose access to that Mastodon node, but all your connections, because all your friends lists and your identity itself is tied to that node. So you can get another Mastodon account at a different Mastodon instance, but your whole friends list and contacts and identity doesn't go with it. So that means all of your history is gone, all of your connections are gone along with that node. Whereas in Patchwork, it's your identity is stored locally on your machine. So you have to not lose your keys, but as long as you don't lose your keys and you have them locally on machine, you can always connect, and you can never lose your connection list and your data history and all that kind of things.
My turn. Okay. Sorry, I couldn't listen to what you just said, but so my name's Laura, and this is a slide that shows just things that have been inspiring me over my life. And then the big purple circle is the company I just founded, and the Berlin versus Amazon with the squiggly line is a group and a coalition I'm part of, because Amazon is building a huge tower in Friedrichshain, where they'll have 3,000 Amazon workers by 2023. And if you haven't heard about this before, you can go to berlinversusamazon.com, where there's more information about the campaign in Berlin and how to stop them. Okay, so I thought in the context of Transmediala about what end-to-end means for me. And I decided, so I'm here with the ponytail, as you can see. It means to me being able to send a picture to my girlfriend's grandma. So this is my girlfriend's grandma and me. And an important thing that Dmytri and Baruch set up really well, I want this connection that I have and the sending of photos to be emancipatory and without the big five, these huge tech companies like Facebook, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Apple. Yeah, 5. Okay. So in a traditional kind of setup, this is actually the setup at my company right now. There's a server. I put my photo on the server, and then my girlfriend's grandma goes to the server and gets that. So this is classic, and we use a software called Nextcloud. So client-server relationship. There's also P2P, so I could send something to my girlfriend's grandma directly, and you think, okay, this is actually interesting because maybe like I am a point of failure. My girlfriend's grandma is a point of failure that's not very stable, but is BitTorrent and other P2P technologies. There's math for that. There's protocols for that. And we can actually have something where there's a lot of connections in this network, and when someone wants to download it, then they have it, but then it's also not a private network, so problematic in other ways. So then coming back to this, we can actually have then a different kind of setup where the Nextcloud server at the bottom is just one node in a network, and we can use a protocol, something like IPFS or something else, with the Nextcloud server as one node in this network. So I'm still communicating directly with my girlfriend's grandma, but there's also a server somewhere as a backup and all these things, and it has a little bit more stability in the system. So this is great. You're like, yay, this is the answer. This is end-to-end. This sounds fantastic. My girlfriend's grandma has the photos from our last vacation, and we're fine. But this actually, as we've talked about, isn't actually like working well, so I'm going to talk about it a little bit more. So let's zoom in a little bit in my girlfriend's grandma's experience. And I didn't say this at the beginning, but the reason I'm using this example, I think people in tech use this example as like, it's so easy, your mom can do it, and it's so fucking sexist. And I think for me, I'm using this example on purpose because it's a part of my feminism that I want to be able to use the technology that I'm building with my girlfriend's grandma. And I'm doing this example on purpose for that reason. So if you look closer at her experience, she has a computer maybe, and then she has to maybe go to the browser. It has to be installed. She has to upload something. There's something called a file system. She has to maybe share it. Maybe in my emancipatory situation, you have to say, do you trust this person? And then click something. You have to figure out a way, what does even trust mean? And then maybe there's also a tablet and a phone involved, and it gets like actually really confusing really quickly, and my girlfriend's grandma is super overwhelmed and it's not working at all. And then I'm upset because I can't send her the photos and everything fails, and I'm like, oh, let's just use Facebook. I'm sorry I put you through this. And then also, grandma's internet just got shut off from the ISP because she's on a fixed income, and the ISP is a monopoly locally, and she can't pay her internet bill anymore. Too bad, doesn't have internet anymore. So there's all these other things, and like I think Baruch did a really good job setting this up. There's all these other layers to this problem. It's not just like, my MacBook doesn't sync with my iPhone. It's a little bit more like, okay, there's like some real issues happening here, and they're all of these things, the real world. Okay, so in this system, there's also other people, right? So it's not just the fact that like, okay, we have all these devices and la la la, and we're kind of like independent. There's also Johannes. Johannes wrote the protocol. Judith approved the bank loan for Johannes' startup that wrote the protocol. And then there's Hans Martin. Hans Martin is the developer that wrote the software, Nextcloud, or whatever software you use, and yeah. And then there's Kat. Kat is the IT administrator who's taking care of the server and making sure that it's running properly. And then there's Michael, and Michael laid the cable in the ground that sets up the internet connection. And there's Julia, who published a blog post about this tool because she thought it was super cool, and that it was posted on Medium, which is a huge blog platform, something that's probably hosted on Amazon servers, I would assume, which Jeff Bezos is making $1 bajillion off of that and plundering the planet. So Jeff Bezos is also involved always, somehow, no matter what, in everything. Oh no, battery.
Don't worry, just keep
Okay, I'm going to get going. Okay, it makes me talk faster. Okay, so then there's Tom, and Tom is, he's mining the cobalt that's making the machine. And then there's Mr. Burns, who's making money off of the mine where Tom works. And all of these people and all this whole system and everything is influenced by the same bullshit. And I just wanted to send a picture. Like, what the hell? This is crazy. And I wanted to do it in an emancipatory way, but like, there's no way. This is so wild. And my girlfriend's grandma's also pretty upset about that. So I don't think we can solve the whole thing, but I'm going to focus, because I'm an engineer, so I'm going to focus now, zoom in a little bit on Johannes and Hans Martin. Oh, and I forgot. Also, Hans Martin's wife, Julia, stays home and takes care of their 3 kids so that Hans Martin can go to conferences and learn more about technology to develop his software. This is my favorite hidden labor in the software community. Okay, so here they are. So I have Johannes and Hans Martin, and they maybe are engineers like me, like maybe they don't talk to their users that much, and so like they're in a situation where they're developing their software kind of like on their own. Maybe they talk to users once, maybe once they release a feature, they see how it's going. But these kinds of like open, direct communication that you would think maybe like they're real people that they need to talk to are like my girlfriend's grandma. Like, that's who they need to be talking to most of the time and, like, center in their thing. So these connections, like, to be made, they're really actually pretty complicated. Like, I learned how to do community organizing and learned how to listen, something that not a lot of people know how to do. So I respect that as a skill. And Johannes and Hans Martin, they also have, like, their own perspectives in this system. So they're influenced by capitalism, imperialism, white supremacy, and they all have like their own outcomes and their own thing. So nothing here is actually neutral at all, and Johannes and Hans Martin can't just build like the perfect system that will save us all. So there's another person in this that is also really important, and they're Kato, and they're a UX designer. So Kato is the kind of person who would maybe talk to me, they would interview my girlfriend's grandma, they would also circle back with Johannes, they would circle back with Hans Martin, and this person would be in charge of like making the connections and truly designing something that's like, yeah, we can actually use. So Kato is only employed right now by huge ass companies. So UX design is something, this is one of the hugest challenges for Kato, is if you want to get a job as a designer, you're getting paid shit and you end up working for massive companies. So these kind of small emancipatory solutions aren't getting the kind of UX design support that they need. And as a community, I think from the leftist software community or engineering community, we don't often integrate UX because we do have our own perspectives. We're engineers. We're building things from that perspective. Like Johannes and Hans Martin, they have their own set of skills, and they think, oh, you know what, someone, if it breaks, they can just go to their terminal and like change this one thing, and they'll just search it on Stack Overflow, no problem. But that's not okay for my girlfriend's grandma, and that's not even okay for me. Like, I can do that, but I won't. So when you have this UX designer in the process, people are feeling heard and they're getting a little bit more excited, maybe the experience is improving. And I know this is kind of a hard drop, but I want to end here that I think that accountability to users in this whole context is a form of solidarity. Because if we're building a truly end-to-end system, it's not actually going to work until we start participating and like having users involved in our systems. And so accountability to users can mean a lot of different things. It doesn't just mean hiring a UX designer, it means thinking holistically about the kinds of systems that we're building. Yeah.
So I also work in software delivery, and I think maybe it would be great to talk a little bit more about what a UX designer actually does, because I think in the industry there's a misconception that they just draw pictures, but it's
everybody know what UX is? User experience.
Yeah. Did you want to get? So a UX designer, it's not just designing like the colors of the website. This is a really important thing. Like, UX is user experience, and so it's really going back to like exactly how you're using something and thinking about how asking them questions, watching them do something, not only like prescribing an answer for them, but really doing like need discovery with them.
So we're going to open the floor after Leif, and then we're going to have a group discussion that everybody's welcome to. So then we really want your feedback at 3 o'clock at the Linka building.
In the meantime, I noticed that Kato is not smiling. Is there a reason for that? Like, it's just too busy.
I noticed that on the way over here and decided that I needed to get here first before making Kato smile.
We're very interested, kind of.
Yeah.
So do you want to
move right down?
more questions?
Not sure. I guess move on to.
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay. People seem to be in a rush to go to
Some other thing, but we'll just keep going. Yeah.
So I want to talk about a few things, but mostly focus about privacy. There's a lot of really exciting peer-to-peer developments in the last years, like DAT and IPFS and Secure Scuttlebutt, and a lot of these things are not really designed for privacy, and for some people that seems fine. And I think that is kind of a disturbing trend, and we really need to actually take privacy into account in designing these sort of systems. For people in the room who don't think privacy is important, I would urge you to think about web searches you would do on your own computer versus someone else's computer, especially somebody who knows who you are and is going to have a browser history. You can't clear the history. There's a sort of, when somebody's looking over your shoulder, you're not as free to explore intellectually. It's like there's just not, it's extremely limiting not having privacy, and it's easy to think I have nothing to hide, but actually if you think about it a little more, you'll find that it sucks always having somebody looking over your shoulder. So in IPFS, the interplanetary file system, when you go to fetch a web page, you're querying a peer-to-peer network, and you're telling a bunch of strangers your IP address and that you're interested in this particular piece of content. And then for a long time after that, you're responding to queries for that. So you're telling people what content you have, which is kind of like your browsing history. So this is not great for if the whole web was on IPFS, we wouldn't have the browser privacy situation would be much worse than it is today, which is already pretty bad, the status quo. And there's a lot of different adversaries that might want that kind of data. There's governments, there's companies trying to, this audience commodity that Dmytri is talking about is sort of democratized in a peer-to-peer system, I suppose. The surveillance capability is democratized, that anybody can just sit there and start harvesting this data. BitTorrent is by far the most successful peer-to-peer system, I think. BitTorrent's great. I'm glad that BitTorrent exists in the world. But its threat model is effectively nothing to hide. Or if you have something to hide, hopefully you have the technical capability to use it with a VPN or take some precautions. But by default, you're telling a bunch of strangers, which include some people that are not your friends, your IP address and what you're looking for and what you've already downloaded. So PeerTube is a really cool thing in like the Fediverse that is like it's basically a YouTube clone that you can run on your own server, but it uses WebTorrent, which is a version of BitTorrent that runs in your browser, and reveals it uploads and downloads the videos you're watching to other people that are watching the same video, which is really nice because it means that the server has much less hosting costs. So it still has quite a lot of hosting costs because not everybody's watching all the videos all the time. So the server still needs to pay a bandwidth bill, but WebTorrent can make it less, but at this enormous privacy cost. So how many people in the room have heard of the Tor network? I assume maybe a few, yeah. So Tor is the most well-known browsing privacy tool. And one thing I hope people can take away from this talk is that Tor is really not very good, but it's also the best we have in many measures. So why is Tor not very good? Well, it's not actually designed to be able to protect you against somebody that can see both ends of the connection. It's somewhat well known that Tor says they don't protect against a global passive adversary that can see the whole network. I'm going to read, just going to read two long sentences from the Tor design document. They say, a global passive adversary is the most commonly assumed threat when analyzing theoretical anonymity designs. But like all practical low latency systems, Tor does not protect against such a strong adversary. And then I'll skip some here. Then they go on to say that it's actually much worse than that. It's not just the very strong adversary. They say, by observing both ends, passive attackers can confirm a suspicion that Alice is talking to Bob if the timing and volume patterns of the traffic on the connection are distinct enough. Active attackers can induce timing signatures on the traffic to force distinct patterns. Rather than focusing on these traffic information attacks, we aim to prevent traffic analysis attacks, where the adversary uses traffic patterns to learn which points in the network he should attack. So Tor, by design, is not protecting you against somebody that can see both ends. And if you imagine a situation where, like, you're, say, to give a real-life example, there was a bomb threat sent at Harvard University. And they knew the time it was sent. They knew that it was sent through Tor. So one end of the connection was known by default by having received the mail. They know that this mail was sent at this time, and it came from Tor. And to find the person that sent it, they just checked their network logs and saw who on the campus was using Tor at that time. I'm not sure the details, but I think there was maybe one person, or maybe there were a few. Then they went to the guy and said, hey, we got you, and he admitted it. But this same sort of scenario works in a small country, say, where there's a user going to a website hosted in that country, and no part of the Tor network is in the country, and the adversary is the local government. They can see both ends of the connection. They see traffic go out into the Tor network, and they see the traffic come back from the Tor network. And even if it's encrypted, the timing and the volume of the traffic can reveal what that is, that it's probably the same person. So over time, you get increased confidence that you've identified that this is the same person. So there's a lot of systems being built to try to do better than that. But it's not cheap from a resource perspective. There's an interesting paper recently called the Anonymity Trilemma, which basically says that you want strong anonymity and low latency and low bandwidth overhead. And you can sort of pick two of those things. You can't have all three. You can pick a balance between the three, but you can't have all three. So Tor picks weak anonymity and low latency and low bandwidth overhead. So if you're downloading at a megabyte a second over Tor, the bandwidth that your connection is using is not much more than a megabyte a second. The latency is relatively low. If you're typing in an interactive session, it's like less than a second a lot. If you add a little bit of latency, and then you can make these correlation attacks a little bit harder. But it's the adding the bandwidth overhead that really makes end-to-end correlation a lot more difficult. Hopefully, people developing these popular end-to-end things will pay more attention to that area of research in the future. Right now, the things that are being developed to protect privacy better are not very end-to-end, unfortunately. There's still a client-server sort of model, so we're left vulnerable to the penny bags attack. In Tor, there's a distinction of relays versus users, so each user is not adding more bandwidth to the network. There's a similar system called I2P, where every user is adding more bandwidth to the network. It is a much more end-to-end system, but because it operates the way it does, every user doesn't actually see the entire network now, because that would be seeing all the users, and they think that would be bad. In practice, you can kind of enumerate it and figure out all the users, so they're getting the worst of both worlds in that sense. The problem with users not having the same picture of the network is that they're no longer uniform, and uniformity is how you have privacy and anonymity. You need things to be indistinguishable from each other. And if I know about a different set of the I2P network than Dmytri knows about, somebody doing network analysis can use our different overlapping views. Maybe we know about some of the same network, but some different parts. I use some relays that he would never use, and that's leaking bits of information that can enable de-anonymization. One last thing I wanted to mention is another sort of conflict, another sort of a spectrum of two things you want. Well, the anonymity trilemma is a triangle of three things, but there's a spectrum between durability and confidentiality, that when you're trying to store some data, you want it to be durable, meaning that it won't be lost. You can get it in the future. And you want it to be confidential, meaning that only you and the people you want to share it with can see it. And things you do to make it more confidential tend to make it less durable, and vice versa. If you imagine encrypting a file and putting it on Dropbox, and then somebody gets a copy of your key, if you could delete it from Dropbox before they get the encrypted data, you've saved the confidentiality property. If you make lots of copies of it, if you put copies of it in many different places, removing the ciphertext becomes more difficult. So lots of copies is obviously the way to achieve durability, but lots of copies makes confidentiality weaker. So picking where your copies go and being able to control access to your ciphertext, even if it's ciphertext, is an important consideration.
Cool. Thanks. I'd like to start the response, and then we'll go to questions finally, and then, of course, what we don't get to handle, we are going to continue at 3 o'clock across the street at the Karl Liebknecht House. So how does privacy really work in all of this? What is do we have to consider privacy first? Or does it have to be in some kind of symbiosis in the development process? Like, it's a trade-off, right? And as you said, so that you have to give up some privacy, you have to give up some confidentiality for functionality. And in a project that's being developed in coordination with a community that's trying to be, like as we're talking about, we should have the design of these platforms integrated in, connected to a constituency that's going to use them, and that's going to help define our priorities. Like, where does privacy, is it really job one?
I think it needs to be considered from the very beginning, yeah. Trying to bolt privacy on later is not, well, it historically hasn't produced very good results. There's a great paper by a guy, Mark S. Miller, about why security is not a separable concern. And I highly recommend that text. When you bolt it on later, you end up with a bunch of things that are hard to work around. You're like, if you look at IPFS, they're talking about, oh, well, maybe we can just run IPFS over Tor. And you can kind of do that, but you're still, if you have a Tor hidden service on your computer, you're still announcing that to their DHT. I'm not sure if you can actually announce an onion address to their DHT yet, but they've been talking about doing that some time ago. And that doesn't reveal your identity or your location by itself, though Tor hidden services, maybe over time you can figure out the location, but it is an identity, and so it links all of the things you're looking at together. So if I put up a new document on IPFS and send you a link, I'm the only person that has it right now, and now you know what my onion address is. So you know that that's me, and you can see all the other things that are, you can test if I have other things and learn what my other activities are. And when I'm online, you can run a thing on your server that just constantly tries to connect and see that, oh, look, I just came online, I just went offline. A presence notification is like been irrevocably granted once you know somebody's address, be it an IP address or a hidden service address.
I mean, I think if you ask users themselves, a lot of users won't start with privacy. They'll start with agency and consent. Users want to have consent over what they share, who they share with. And so, so I think from a user point of view, it's definitely agency and consent. Who do I agree with communicating? Who do I want to know what about me? What information do I want to share with everybody? And I may choose to be very promiscuous in some cases with the information that I share, and then I may choose to be very private. But in order to offer that consent, the network has to be able to give those strong privacy guarantees, right? You cannot offer consent. I cannot let you choose what's private and what's not private if the network can't actually deliver a claim on privacy.
And I think there's there's no real way to guarantee privacy. So also being honest about our own ability as engineers to ensure privacy, because we just can't do it. And so I see a lot of people who I talk to who are like, oh, my friend like goes to crypto party all the time and goes to Seabase and told me to use this thing and now it's secure, but it's actually just not.
Absolutely. And so, I mean, I think what's come up a bunch of times is also like contradictions, right? Like, the durability versus privacy and things like that, right? Or kind of what the software affordances are versus what the material affordances are, like in your slide with your grandmother being attacked or your girlfriend's grandmother being attacked by imperialism, capitalism, and all those sorts of things. So this is also something interesting from the point of view of UX and the whole design, right? So like, centering the user, sounds a lot like dialectical materialism, like we were talking about before. The whole build, measure, learn, think, make, check design cycle always means strong interaction with the user, being user by the driven, presenting things, getting them actually in the real world, finding out how they're impacting the real world and how and having empathy for the users, observing the users, and feeding back, right? And so this is kind of key into resolving a lot of these contradictions, right? So we have these contradictions, we have these trade-offs. The way to figure it out is to work with close communities. The reason I'm standing down here is because we want to take your question. So who has a question? Oh, right here. I'm sorry.
Hi. Can everyone hear me? I have a question that goes to you, actually. When I think of anonymity and privacy, I always ask myself, well, in the real world, do I expect to be anonymous? And I wouldn't go out with covering completely up and being completely anonymous, because that's not an expectation of mine. So sorry, I get nervous. So when I go online and I want to be anonymous, I want to be protected. I want to say I don't have an expectation of being anonymous, but I have an expectation, a valid expectation of people not making money off of me. It's the same as I don't go out on the street and people take pictures of me and sell them somewhere. I can have that expectation, and I should be able, with the protection of my government and politics, and that's a judicial problem of the law, to basically hunt down people who do that because it's illegal. And that's not, I wouldn't blame that on a software engineer for saying the network is incapable, or having funds for software that could deliver that to a certain extent and have service that can take up that load of ensuring anonymity, but saying it's also a lot on the law to go and hunt down firms or wherever they're placed in the Indian Ocean or wherever, and say you're not allowed to do that, you're committing a crime, and enabling them to actually get these people to be fined and protect your data that way.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, I think that's a really good point.
No, you can go, sure. Well, I was going to say the regulatory enforcement avenues, I think, are important. It's nice people. There's the GDPR in Europe now, and that's being enforced a bit. It's, but I'm not like, obviously that can't solve all the violations of privacy that are happening. So we need diversity of tactics, which includes technical measures, of course. About walking down the street, of course, most people don't cover their face walking down the street, but you also wouldn't publish, say, your location log all the time. Like, you could easily have an app on your phone that records your location and publishes it for the whole world to see, and very few people here would do that. But most people here are sending their location to a few big companies. So there's probably hundreds of people at Google and Amazon that, if they really wanted to, could actually follow you around the city and see everywhere you're going. But Laura had another response.
Yeah, I think while you were talking, I thought about safety, and from a feminist perspective, thinking about or an intersectional feminist perspective, like what it means to be safe. So it's not only maybe about anonymity, I can't say that word, but it's about also like I want to be anonymous now because if I'm not in this certain amount of anonymous, maybe I don't feel safe or something like that. Maybe, or I see a connection there. And there's this campaign in the city. I'm from Chicago, and there's a campaign from the Black Lives Matter movement called She Safe, We Safe. And it basically is founded on the idea that, like, I mean, from black feminism in the US, like, when black women get free, everyone is free. And I think it's also kind of in this idea, it's like we can maybe choose our own kind of anonymity, but we have to also think about like everybody's needs and like my girlfriend's grandma's needs also in order to like get everybody kind of, give everybody the kind of safety that they need online. Yeah.
Yeah, just one last note is that there are some things that are out of scope of the technological development, which are like institutional, that we have to generate to provide ethics, for example, to decide what features are prioritized at various parts of the development process.
Okay, so I see lots of hands going up there, and people want to discuss this, but I want to talk about something else, and I have the microphone. So I want to make, Laura alluded to something, and I wanted to ask about it, which is this idea that, you know, you don't pay for Facebook, the internet is free for all kinds of things, but unless your parents are paying for your data package or you hacked your neighbor's WPA key or something, most of us actually are, in fact, paying a certain sector of industry for internet quite a lot of money. And that's the telecommunications companies that are extremely powerful and have always been an extremely powerful corporate entity in this world. Now, there was a time, as I understand it, that during the build-out of the internet, that the National Science Foundation in the United States was given the remit basically to commercialize the internet. And previous to that, it was possible that there was an idea that we might have an internet that was actually free, that you could access it. But since that time, as I understand, that within the International Telecommunications Union and other bodies, there's been a definite effort to actually not allow people, to prohibit you from connecting to people, to prohibit you from running wires around your community, or indeed putting up Pringles boxes with whatever mesh Wi-Fi stuff you like. So, you know, as we saw there, you know, Laura's girlfriend's grandmother got cut off because it's like, sorry, you're too poor, get off of our network. We only want, you know, if you don't have any money, you can get the hell out of here because this is for money. So, and there are lots of people in the world that, you know, even though we talk about connecting the next billion all the time, you know, and this kind of stuff, it's really not. There's a lot of legislation that is saying you can't connect people, you can't do this unless you know, it's controlled by somebody and is making money. And you know, so the malicious people in the world are all involved in this, you know. So if there was some way that we could deal with that, then would we be able to divert the resources that people are paying for their gigabyte data package and their 30 gigabyte blah blah thing router modem in the house to be able to deal with the penny bags problem of you know, where users would actually then free up this resource to be able to pay for the services and the administrators of the services that they need. So you know, rather than you know, when you download a YouTube video, not only is it being monetized by the ads that are on it, but you're also paying for the data on the wire to the telco. So, you know, do you have thoughts on dealing with that one?
Responsible. I mean, again, it's a bit somewhat out of scope. I think we have to acknowledge that our engagement to improve this situation that we're in today has to be operative inside the tech development sector. But a lot outside, like where we're organizing on the streets and in communities, etc. So, for example, I think Dmytri mentioned that the proposal for municipal broadband has been floated across America. So that's a political movement that is trying to make to do exactly what you just described. Try to make everybody able to experience being online together at a nominal cost or no cost as a part of your taxes that you pay for your municipality, and then you can dedicate your resources to supporting other projects.
And I think that the engineers need a structural analysis in order to get hip to the fact that they're not fixing the problem. Yeah.
So I just also wanted to remind everybody that we're having a discussion at 3. So this format we'll do our best in, but this format is really a difficult format to have a rich discussion in. So if you join us at Linka Building at 3, then we'll really have an ability to listen to everybody and have a deeper discussion. But you're next.
You just foretook a lot of my argument, so it's just nice because now I have time for something else. Because I wanted to start at this point of having of saying, or there are the ISPs, they are not neutral, the network is not neutral, and how can we kind of have alternative infrastructures to build these technologies on? We described, or you described in the past hour. And because I think it's really, really necessary, but I also feel if we think of municipatory internet structures, we still have this problem of like this neoliberal inherited ideas of definitely also language problem of progress and speed, and it will definitely be slower, and it will be different, and will be. And this is also addressing this UX issue, what Laura had in her talk, of we need also to heavily criticize the language currently used, like the idea of a cloud, which is super ephemeral, which is actually an illusion of some like really materialistic infrastructure. And we have to also address this like a language, like the word of the user, as something really one-dimensional, which is using something, instead brilliantly pointed out also a product and also like labor force. So my question really is, how can we overcome this like neoliberalistic ideas of progress and of speed in terms of the internet? Because with all the technology spoken about, I really also have the fear that this could be kind of a stop to all of this, that it will be slow in the end and people won't adopt to it. And also the question of language.
Yeah, I think that it doesn't, I mean, to some degree, it really does help us bring language, or terms can bring us together and give us new insights, and I think the more language, the better in general. But I think that, you know, for communities and constituencies to support alternative forms of technology, and therefore like an alternative mode of reproducing their capacity to produce and for each other, to live well, that has to be, that's a question that's out of scope. It's not a question of wording. It's a question of building affordances in your community and supporting each other, and the tech has to help these people who are already, the movements are already there. They're already supporting political efforts to change how our reality today is reproduced, change the conditions, and you know, the these platforms can support them more beneficially, more effectively. But they are the ones that have to push the whole thing forward. The movements have to push everything forward. What we do on the application level can only serve them. You know, so that's why we need to listen to how, you know, because otherwise, if they cannot eat and they cannot put a roof over their heads, and they cannot get their kids in school, then they're not going to. It doesn't matter what platform they're using.
Well, maybe exactly to the point. My name is Felipe. I've been working for more than 15 years with social movements in Brazil and cultural movements in Brazil and technology. I'm away from Brazil for this couple of years. But I think I liked a lot what Laura made of exposing the hidden labor at some, in some senses. And of talking about UX and UI, that I guess is one of the major factors restricting different people, not only a self-selective group of people interested in privacy and these questions, but restricting other people to act more responsibly in their use of technologies. But on the other hand, I guess there are at least another two big issues. One of them is one of infrastructure and access and neutrality. So in Brazil right now, if you go to social movements, organized social movements, and you ask them, they will say that, yeah, they would love to have a, privacy-aware platform in which they can talk to each other, and that can even help them to get a roof over their heads and to get food. If you show them Signal, for instance, it's quite like WhatsApp, and so it's not the worst compromise, but they won't be able to use it because the cheap internet plans they have will only have access to WhatsApp. or Facebook. And that's one thing that is very hard to solve from the tech side. It's not about development, it's about changing the way policies are made, and in the world right now, specifically in Brazil, policies are made in the worst way. And there's also the social effect that, and another restriction is that people in this context usually have access to very low-cost devices, and you ask them to install another application alongside the ones that they already have that their family use. It's very hard. So there's lots of barriers, and I don't want to sound like hopeless, but I guess there are a lot of other things that go beyond the reach of what sort of technology we should develop.
Ditto, agree. Yeah.
Zero rating, for people in the room who aren't familiar, is this practice that's very common in the Global South and is coming to Europe also, of having cell phone plans that include unlimited data or much higher limit for certain sites like Facebook and WhatsApp. And this is an incredibly horrible practice that is hard to argue against because people like things that are free. And if you say, oh no, Facebook shouldn't be free, well, obviously people should be able to afford to get more data to use anywhere on the internet. But there aren't good solutions there. In situations where people can't afford to use something other than WhatsApp, then WhatsApp is maybe the best choice in some situations. But the bottom line of digital security advice that I try to tell people is don't trust computers. Never trust a HAL 9000. Use it because you have to, but be aware that it's not trustworthy.
Just really quick, on the developer side also, I have access to a lot of cheap IPs. So that's like another thing from the architecture perspective, that like there's also people don't have access to being able to publish their services on the internet anyway, even in their local network.
So because we have to kind of close up in a minute, we're just going to take these two questions together. So just two questions in a row, then final response, and then we'll see everybody at 3 o'clock at the Linka, where we have much more time for deeper discussion.
Hi, just a quick sort of issue, maybe better discussed in the workshop, but I'd go back to the previous commenter's point on language, and I think we have to be very careful and maybe even establish some sort of mission coherence, to steal a phrase from someone else, when we start to talk about communities and the misuse of that word, and in particular communities of users when we're talking about technological systems. Because once we start talking about that, how do we then reconcile the philosophy of end-to-end, of people participating and giving more than they are taking or consuming of a service? And I don't quite accept that giving is mediated by the technical brilliance of the system architecture. I think that's something that should be thought about in a little more depth, if that makes sense.
Who's it for? I wasn't asking for it, but...
That's it.
Anybody, last question? And then, as I said, we can go much deeper at 3 o'clock at the Gottlieb House.
Thanks. Well, somehow, as to sum it up about the social implications that were evoked either through the UX person actually taking care of what the people think about, or these notions of contextual, local factors for adoption. Well, I agree with most of what has been exposed here, which is a rare thing for a panel. Most of the research, most of the theory appears right to me. Yet, when you speak of Mastodon, and even if I agree with the flaws in the software and its model itself, I can't help but want to look into the Fediverse itself. And the Fediverse not as a technical solution. Sure, there's this activity pub protocol, but the Fediverse more as a social and political fact. When we speak of the Fediverse, we not only speak of Mastodon, we speak of Pleroma, which is much lighter in server cost and running cost, but we also speak of Funkwhale, PixelFed, Kibu, Monk, Mobi, Garcio, Goth.io. Most of them I didn't even hear of myself. So how about the Fediverse as a collective platform, maybe a collective dream for experimenting, for sharing experience, for trying, erring, failing, for building rough consensuses, for fighting sometimes, for banning, abusing power, witnessing abuses of power. And in the end, through the practice, get to establish the better protocols. How about secure scuttlebutt interacting with the Fediverse and combining best of both worlds? So my point here is that we could endlessly get delighted with very, very right theory delivered through Max and through Twitter. But how about also some practice? And starting with the experiment where our dreams are and where they can go.
So, yeah. That's like the perfect segue for practice, because we're about to go to the workshop at 3 where we do practice. So, yeah.
You want to close up last Thursday?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Fediverse is wonderful, and I love it so much that I'm tired of watching it die over and over and over and over again. And I think that's the core of the criticism. Not that it's not wonderful. I mean, I said Usenet was my mastodon, and that was how I experienced the internet and how I got excited about the internet. And I think that's the thing about the Fediverse, is that it does offer a fantastic potential, but because of the penny bags attack and its other flaws, it dies and it dies and it dies. And we talk about new platforms all the time. You mentioned 3 new ones today. And yeah, I think I completely agree that the experimentation is important, and I completely agree that it provides real value to the people that are participating in it. And that value is real, right? Just like Usenet was real to me. There's people having incredible experiences on Mastodon. It's just that those platforms are doomed to die over and over and over again. And yes, we live to fight another day, but we need to understand why they die and what causes them to die in order to evolve beyond them.
All right, well, that's all the time we have. So if you're into more, sticking around, and we'll be around all day, but also come to our workshop, as you must have heard already. Across the street.